This morning to start the session off, but I'm dealing at home with a sick animal that meant I couldn't be here. I realised also I was intending to set the scene with the presentation that I was going to give. What I will be doing, I think now, is confirming some of the themes that you were discussing in the last session, but I think I will also set a few new hares running, or chickens running, to actually follow the line of whether it's humour or not. I think is questionable. I want to start off with a global perspective and actually illustrate to you that the problems of rivers actually is a global set of problems. These are data compiled by the Zoological Society of London and WWF, based on about 3,500 species collected, monitored at least twice over the last 40 or 50 years. And they illustrate to us, in fact, that river systems, freshwater ecosystems, are hemorrhaging biological diversity faster than any other ecosystem type on Earth. And that is occurring for two principal reasons. One is that freshwaters are hotspots for biological diversity, but also they're hotspots for human use and activity. We depend on water. We manage river catchments throughout the world for purposes where we neglect to think about the downstream consequences. And these data globally reflect the fact of those two things actually co-occurring: hotspots for human activity, hotspots for human use. We can see examples here in the United Kingdom and indeed in Wales that illustrate that we are contributing to that global trend. So these are some increasingly well-known and famous data indicating, for example, for this wonderfully iconic organism, the Atlantic salmon. If you look at the right-hand side, catches for this species have been declining now since essentially the 1980s when I came to Wales. The Y system, the General 7 system, was responsible for about 25% of all the rod-coat salmon in England and Wales. Catches have been declining precipitously. If you look across the whole of the areas in which Atlantic salmon spawn, we are at critical risk of losing this organism. And the big figure on the left-hand side is a projection around the point at which the populations of Atlantic salmon are falling below the critical threshold to maintain this species. In the River Tavy, for example, we could be looking at extinction within a small number of decades. Much of the debate in England and Wales has focused around water quality, in particular on sewage. And anyone looking at the media over the past few years will have seen just how many news stories, just how many events focus on things such as CSOs, in particular, combined sewer overflows. I want to show you that the circumstances we are dealing with are actually far more complicated, both in terms of the trajectory and in terms of the causes of the problems of the trajectories that we see. These are some data that we published probably about a month ago, looking at essentially led by one of our PhD students, looking at the whole-scale trends in river organisms, river invertebrates, over a 3-decade period from the early 1990s up until 2019, and it goes up to 2019 because after that point we run out of data. What you see on this figure are two different things. On the left-hand side, trajectories in the richness of organisms, the number of different types of invertebrates. On the right-hand side, trends in clean water organisms. Anywhere that's blue on this map were areas that were essentially improving, at least up to about 2010. Anywhere that's red are areas that are now deteriorating, and I want to come back and focus on those in my very last slide. But one of the key points is that, in fact, the legislation that we enacted in the early 1990s had a positive effect, in particular on the urban environment. The Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, coupled with industrial decline, actually led to quite widespread improvement in the quality, in particular, of urban rivers. And if you look where we are here in the Taff, I could take you within a small number of kilometres of here and show you clean water organisms like dippers, clean water mayflies, even rare species such as March brown, otters. Here's Will Millard holding an Atlantic salmon that he caught in the Taff. Now, Atlantic salmon numbers are declining in the Taff, but all those other species are actually persisting because urban river environments in general have been improving. At least that was the kind of story up until about 10 years ago. Again, this is a story that the Times ran based on some of our data, illustrating that although we'd had some impetus, some recovery, that started to stall in about 2010 onwards. And we've been trying to understand just exactly what the causes of that stalling were. And there are various candidate explanations, which I will give you some of, and some of the ones we've been investigating. If you look, for example, at legacy chemicals, industrial chemicals, flame retardants such as PBDEs, PCBs, which I know there is specific interest in the room, we still see clear evidence that these compounds are accumulating through Welsh food webs. The data on the right is a map essentially with a series of points illustrating the concentrations of PBDEs, flame retardants, that occur in the eggs of dippers, and the measures we've made illustrate that those concentrations are higher in the South Wales valleys than have ever been measured in songbirds anywhere else on Earth. And they are sufficient to have a negative biological effect. So on the one hand, we've had clean water organisms recovering in urban areas, but paradoxically that now exposes them to other forms of pollution. Here's another one, and this is another one of the hairs that I wanted to set running. These are some data collected by a series of my master's students, in fact, in Cardiff University, looking at the distribution of different pharmaceutical compounds in two Welsh rivers. On the right-hand side, the Taff; on the left-hand side, a small stream known as Roath Brook. And what you see in both these cases is that as you progress downstream in these rivers, there is a dramatic increase in the array of pharmaceutical compounds, both human and veterinary, either when you move downstream of significant wastewater treatment works on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side where you enter the city of Cardiff, and there is a risk of inappropriate drainage and sewer misconnections actually yielding those chemicals to the river environment. The red bars, by the way, are caffeine, and caffeine helps us to tie these chemicals to a specific human source because we are big users of caffeine. We've just been using caffeine in our coffee break. Some of these chemicals we know are reaching toxic levels for organisms. Pet flea treatments as an example, but some of the other human pharmaceuticals as well. And any condition that we have, typically the pharmaceuticals in some form will find their way as excreted or waste products in the water environment. Another emerging pollutants that we've been looking at, you'll see dippers, by the way, are a bit of a theme for my research. I've been looking at this organism for about 40 years in various ways. If we look at microplastics as an example, globally we're now putting about 20 million tonnes of plastics in the oceans annually. That will increase to about 50 million tonnes probably in the next 20 years. But we can, in the river environment, already see evidence that plastics are moving through food webs. Half of the prey that dipper use in the Taff system contain plastic fibres. We think we can do a calculation based on the energy needs that dippers have. They're ingesting about 200 microplastic fragments every day. They're feeding their chicks something like 5,000 to 8,000 microplastic fragments before the chicks fledge. We think this material is passing through them, and at the moment we don't have any evidence of adverse effects. But here, of course, is a potential vector for some of those other chemicals that we have been talking about. And finally, I did promise to come back to this slide about where we think that the deterioration in the river environment is now most rapid. And if you look at the red areas, you'll see that places such as West Wales, places such as the Dee system, areas where we were talking about with intensive agriculture and intensive dairy, with lots of slurry pollution incidents, are the areas where actually things are declining. The right-hand figure is a little bit more complicated, and what we actually, when we analyse the patterns here, we think that there is a shift from problems being driven by sewage to nutrients and in particular climate change. We haven't mentioned the impacts of climate change on fresh waters very much this morning, but they are very real and they are increasing. And I will stop at that point.